regular meeting of Marin Wildfire on August 28th, 2025. And I think the first thing to do is roll call.
Roll call. So from the members of, I should pull up that document, right? Sorry. Thank you. Okay, is Jenny Biggs here?
Yes.
Okay. Jim Wagner?
He's out of town.
Okay, not here. John McCauley?
Here and present.
Well, Larry Minikis, sorry.
I'm here for sure.
And Pat Randolph here. And Rebecca Suggs?
She's not.
She would not be able to do it then.
Okay. Scott Pinsky?
Here.
And Theo Hellman.
I think he had a school conflict.
Yeah, he's a student. Okay. So we do have, well, he's not a voting member, so we have a quorum, right? So good.
Got a quorum around the table.
Great. And can we tell if we have any members of the public?
I cannot see that.
We do not.
Okay. So I think everybody saw the agenda. Any adjustments that anybody wanted to request? Okay, all good. Okay, so then I think we can go to the open time for public expression.
With no public present.
Then we'll move on. So then, Mark, you're up. We get to get the staff report.
Yeah, I'll be real quick. I know I saw some of you at Emberstop. I hope most of you had an opportunity to make Emberstop, at least if you're on this continent. And
I didn't.
That was a good excuse.
Yeah,
I was on the continent, but in another latitude.
Okay.
You've heard about it.
Stomping hammers in Europe instead.
you know, I couldn't be happier with Emberstop. Last year we estimated 5,000 people. The year prior we estimated 5,000 people. And so we were wondering if we hit a stagnant point. And we ended up with 6,000 people this year, which is a 20% increase. And it's not just validated by clicks, but we sold 20% more food. So that's a good way to gauge attendance. And so that's awesome. I know Marin Master Gardeners has been really cognizant of documenting their contacts in their booth. And if I remember right, you guys doubled your amount of physical face-to-face contacts at the Marin Master Gardeners crew. Wow. So that's an increase of people, but also an increase of face-to-face time. And then we changed things up as far as Marin Wildfire's presence. The first couple of Emberstops, Fire Safe Marin was up front with Marin Wildfire kind of in a support role. Last year we came to where we're side by side. This year we were purposely pushing Marin Wildfire up front and having Fire Safe Marin as a support role. And as you went in, as you guys probably saw, you had to go past Marin Wildfire's booths this time. You couldn't get past us without talking to us. And in previous years, we only had one tent. This year, we actually set up 5 different tents that was aligned with each of our 5 goals. And then we had 2 people per tent to be interactive with our residents. If they wanted to pull up a Chipper Day stuff, if they wanted to look at their grants, we had people with iPads. And we're not as smart as Marin Master Gardeners and actually counting the contacts as we will next year. But we had more people at all 5 tents all day long, more than we had at one tent the previous year. So if you're going to look at it that way, we had a 500% increase in the amount of time that we were able to be face to face. One of the things I also appreciated about this year's Emberstomp was our vendors. We've always had, the last several years, we've had a really good pool of vendors, but some of the vendors were trying to look towards public safety and kind of market their wares to public safety, but that's not the intent of Emberstomp. Is to market, our intent is for the residents. I think we had a much better representation of vendors that were looking to engage with residents rather than public safety. So I thought that was a huge win. There were 12 different burn demonstrations that all went really well. and there was a dunk tank that I sat on for
That's the
over an
highlight that
hour.
I heard.
And probably was in the water a third of the time.
How
that I
many, yeah, how many people got you?
More than I can count. So, if I would have had a counter, it would have gotten water. So,
Was it a hot day?
it was an average day.
A lot less hot.
Was the water warm or cold?
It was cold, but it was a blast. So, very happy about Ember Stomp.
I think Kathleen should give a Master Gardener report on Ember Stomp.
Love to hear it.
Well, gosh, we spent hours and hours and hours. Had a really good team behind us. We have a really active Fire Smart Landscaping group now. We had 5 tents. One of which we did this year was we made actual demonstration garden. Did you all see our demonstration garden? So that was a side garden. We had a zone 0 in that, and then we showed, basically you couldn't even really tell. I mean, it was like, oh, you guys have a garden, and they're like, oh, there's the 0 compliance right there. And then you walked into the first tent and you looked out the window past the zone 0 and at the garden. You don't really see the zone 0 from inside the house, which I think is something that's lost on people. So we wanted to show that. There we had dominoes, and the dominoes showed connectivity of fire. So we were able to show how a fence would fall along to either the gate that stopped it, which was a metal gate, or all the way to the house. We had vegetation, we had islands in that, demonstrated in that, the dominoes. We also had the model again, remember the model, which we had last night at the Firewise event, which just shows Fire Smart Landscaping, which is a great tool to bring people in. We had a mulch tent focusing on the different kinds of mulch, where you put it, the non-combustible as opposed to the combustible bench. There was a lot of misinformation out there about mulch. That was probably the number one question we got. A lot of people said you can't have any mulch anywhere on the property that's wood, and that's patently false. It's appropriate in some locations, and we try to clear up some misinformation there. We also had a pruning tent for maintenance, and we had not only, we had iPads this time where we had the Marin Master Gardener's website on it and some information there about how do I choose a plant for my location. So we actually had a couple people there helping with plant choices. And then we had the natives tent, which actually had some good examples. And we even had some pruning demonstrations too. So it was really a full wraparound event for us. And we just really appreciated being there and being able to bring such a robust situation there.
No, it's great.
And Kathleen's discussion about fences we made, and in combination with the vendors I told you about, we had 4 different fencing contractors that are showing non-wood fences. So that's a huge step in the right direction, because that's been one of the number one things we've heard from our residents. We want to fix our fence, but we don't have any contractors that know how to do it. So
Do they pay to display by the way?
yes,
Oh, so that even subsidizes the event.
correct.
That's great.
Yeah.
And the food helps subsidize, or is it just sort of net?
That's the,
Yeah.
if we don't have food, there's going to be less people.
Yeah.
I think that fence thing is very much not known in general. Pretty big surprise when you first hear it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Certain things always surprise me when I refer to them, like rosemary is the other one. But
What was really helpful about the Marin Master Gardeners too is if people say, well, where do I get fences? We'd go, oh, right over there, go talk to them. Oh, where, where do I learn more about,
great.
whatever it is, we could just, over there, Fire Safe
One-stop
Marin
shopping.
Master Gardeners, so.
And did you all reach out to all the garden clubs? Because I know my mom and her garden club buddies were excited to go, and I didn't know if they had heard through Marin Master Gardeners or where.
That's a good question.
Urban
We
outreach.
advertised the best we can, so any way anybody can get a hold of Marin Master Gardeners, we pushed it.
how about the old vent question? I did my vents a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. I got a local handyman to help me out. And it was quite interesting how the local hardware stores had no idea what we're talking about, right?
Oh, sure they do.
They
That's
went,
why I
well,
got
we
mine.
well, I went to Goodman's, they
Yeah,
were good.
if you can, if yours are the right
If-
size.
or if you go to the right people.
But,
Right.
but if.
What's
if
the
you're-
one in Fairfax, the
Fairfax
lumber?
Yeah.
They had them, and the Rafael lumber, I think, had them. And
Well,
I mean,
the interesting thing about my house is nothing was the size of the ones you can buy.
well,
So Kazoo had to
Yeah, if it's a special order, that might be different.
had to make them up, but she knew exactly how to do all the layers to.
Well, I'm gonna touch on that a little bit too.
Asking for an opinion. So do you think what we all saw happen in LA has woken that percentage of population in Marin that really wasn't paying that much attention, and maybe it's also helping to bring people out? Just an opinion here.
I wouldn't say no to that.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely a help. It's interesting in response to LA, and I'll bring that up with the Board of Forestry as they work through their Zone 0 definition. It's turning into a battle, a contentious battle, and one of the strongest populations against Zone 0 right now is from Los Angeles. It's super surprising that Los Angeles of all areas would have the strongest contingent against Zone 0. A lot of it is misinformation. I actually had the opportunity to chat with one of the Board of Forestry members today, and he had a face-to-face and was able to walk around a house with one of the loudest opponents. And once she actually heard and saw what they were really talking about, and instead of hearing what the critics have been saying, and once she did her own research, she actually changed her mind about it. And my friend gave me a different way of looking at Zone 0 I never thought of before. Zone 0 is essentially the end of your finger to the opposite shoulder. That's all you're talking about.
So what didn't she understand that once she learned it,
A lot of the misinformation about Zone 0 is that, first of all, there'll be no trees. Second of all, they're saying that the no trees is going to extend into Zone 1, and that there's going to be the creation of heat islands, and then the privacy screening between properties are two of the biggest points of contention. So we've been tracking Zone 0 with the Board of Forestry really, really close. The policy plea that they have right now, I think it's a pretty good one. It would allow potted plants. The potted plants would have to be less than 18 inches tall, less than 5 gallons, non-combustible container, and away from windows. Mature trees can be in Zone 0 as long as they're limbed up and they're not overhanging the roof. And I look at my house and I have a tree that's really close to Zone 0, and I look at it, I legitimately can meet that guideline.
10 feet, right?
Yeah, and still have shade, because it's a tree that's on the south aspect of my house that I very much want the shade that comes from that tree. And so I'm looking at it going, yeah, I'm going to be able to comply with that. I like where they landed with decks, treated the deck as part of the structure, and Zone 0 would have to extend around the deck. And then you would have to, if it's a tall deck, you would have to have enclosures or mesh to keep the embers from. So I like where they're going. That being said, once it gets to the political process, who knows? The politicians may weigh in, but I have a feeling that whatever definition that the Board of Forestry comes up with, and also whatever geographical footprint that is decided upon, the insurance industry is likely to have a bit of a stricter definition of Zone 0, and they're definitely going to have, in my opinion, a bigger geographical footprint. And I'll use myself as an example. I'm one house away from the very high fire threat on CAL FIRE's maps. So if the city of Santa Rosa follows those maps, my neighbor will have to be Zone 0 compliant. I will not. But I am fairly confident within a year or two, 70 days before I am due to renew my insurance, I'm getting a phone call that says, if you want us to insure you, you will be Zone 0 compliant. And this is as your insurer, definition of Zone 0. So that's where I think Zone 0 is going.
I think one of the biggest issues, maybe I'm old news on this, but when Mill Valley started this years ago, we had to call the cops to our building to control the building. And one of the issues that we felt with through litigation, which cost us a bunch of money, was the question of what the state authority, what are the zones called?
SRA?
Yeah,
State responsibility versus local
responsibility, yeah.
responsibility.
Federal, state, and then local. And we were in local, and there's a whole CEQA thing that we were tortured with. So I don't know where that stands.
Neither do I.
It's something you really have to be conscious of. If you were a city and you're trying to legislate,
So you're
As to
saying
whether
there's
you
gonna
have
be
to just-
different zone zero standard, state, local, and
The,
federal?
the,
It's a question of who has.
Aligning them basically.
No, the question is, there are different rules of CEQA that exist within those three groups.
Mm.
And the CEQA
Wow.
exemption levels are much more difficult at the local
I
area.
believe the way this is, I'm not
So we
100%
spent a
sure.
lot of money in litigation on this when we tried to get this done.
Not 100% sure, but my understanding is of the way the assembly bill is written, it does apply to the LRA and would put the same exemptions
So
into.
that would be good.
Yeah.
I just to be aware of it.
Yeah. It's worth digging into. So one way or another, we're going to have residents that want zone zero, whether it's because they know it's the right thing to do to protect their homes, or they want their insurance, or they need to come into compliance with codes and ordinances. And so I think you guys have heard me talk about Zone Zero in a Box, which is a new program. Kathleen has accepted the position as Senior Wildfire Mitigation Specialist, so she will be the lead for our Zone Zero in a Box program. And then a gentleman by the name of Joe Lewis, not the boxer, but Joe Lewis, will be our grant specialist.
Darn it, I thought you were gonna say you had Joe Lewis to enforce it.
And so they will be our Zone Zero in a Box team. And we're just figuring out, since they're both with the D-Space Alliance, I need to figure out the exit plan from D-Space to Zone Zero in a Box. We've already got Fireside teed up to be our software vendor. That'll be in project management. So it's seamless from D-Space inspection to the resident knowing they have Zone Zero issues to take care of, to entering the Zone Zero in the Box program. So we're super excited about that.
So one of the issues I would make also about this, besides the CEQA thing, is that a lot of people who live, and it varies by city, right? If you live in Novato or you live in Mill Valley, your kind of views are a little more jaundiced if you live in a heavily wooded area. And you told me that you need 80% compliance, right? Which actually makes sense to me. In other words, if 8 out of 10 houses follow these rules, you actually can stop fire. And all my neighbors say this is total.
Yes.
We don't believe in it. We don't believe in it because we're in a forest. What can we do? And the answer is actually it does make a difference. I'm a big advocate for it, but that message I think needs to be very well understood that all of you have to do it or it doesn't matter.
Critical mass.
Right? You need 80%.
Herd
Right?
immunity.
70 to 80.
Yeah.
It's a herd immunity concept.
Right.
So
So I think that message needs to get out there to dissuade people from their jaundiced view of like, this is gonna, well, I have to cut my trees down, I have to put a fence that doesn't go to my house. This is all nonsense, government overreach. It's not gonna make any difference. My house is gonna burn down anyway. That's the, so
I
they do
just
that
resigned
constantly.
Yeah.
Right.
to destruction. They've thrown up their hands.
So we need some
Nothing we
very
can do.
visible success stories.
They
Yeah,
believe,
yeah.
they believe it's government nonsense.
And good marketing.
Yes.
That's, all my neighbors believe that, honestly.
Wow.
Right? And as a former mayor, I hear it constantly, right? Because again, we live on the side of a hill, which is highly dense and it's a different vibe as to where you live. In Novato, I feel like, oh, it's so sensitive, right? And I explain to them, I talk about the movie, that you've all seen the film and how it all works and all that kind of stuff. But there is a lot of skepticism out there. So I think to address that directly and say, yes, be skeptical because if you do it and your neighbor doesn't, it's not gonna make a difference. But if you say you do it and 8 out of your 10 friends do it, it will make a difference and the science is there. That's just a part of the message I would think is
I
important.
totally agree. And that's also one of the reasons why the Zone Zero in a Box program will have group discounts. If you get enough residents on your street to do it, then you're going to get a discount. Finally, to close out my executive officer's report, we had a board of directors meeting that was 3 years in the coming, and that was our public works plan to increase the pace and scale of our work in coastal Marin. So we have been working with the Coastal Commission to create the Public Works Plan, which is not really a plan. They call it a Public Works Plan, but what it really is a expedited permitting process to get work done in the coastal zone.
Like my CEQA comment earlier.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
And so we had a lot of public comment, both for and against the Public Works Plan, but the board unanimously voted to support it. And we are met with the Coastal Commission today, and it looks to be that it will be December that Public Works Plan would be going to the Coastal Commission for approval. The good news, though, is that through the governor's exemption, we have multiple projects that have been approved through the governor's exemption. And today we started a project in the coastal zone.
Ah, great.
And we have 3 other projects teed up to start. So before we even have our PWP going to the Coastal Commission, we're gonna have 4 projects in the coastal zone that are gonna be underway. Now, we didn't bypass any best practices, environmental practices. We just were able, through the governor's exemption, streamline the approval. Where the PWP will come into effect is when we need to start maintaining those projects that we did. Through the governor's exemption, we'll be using the PWP as the permitting process to maintain those projects. So because of the governor's exemption, we probably started projects a year to year and a half sooner than we would have.
So is it likely that that zone will exceed 100%
Yes.
in court?
Yeah.
Which is a good thing.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
We, as you guys probably know, for this fiscal year that we're currently in, we overfunded that zone $500,000 above its allocated core revenue.
So in West Marin, forgetting about the outliers,
Mhm.
are you feeling that there's community support for the work you're doing out there?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. And so one of our next field trips that we have will be out in West Marin, just because to your point, Larry, I've had residents in West Marin say, how can we get our own revenue source for work to get done in West Marin? Because we just don't feel like Marin Wildfire has as much of a presence out here in West Marin as it does in the core. And I'm like, we're trying to go through the regulatory process, so we really want to have some demonstrable projects out in West Marin so that those taxpayers can feel that they're getting the attention that they deserve and they're getting the investment out of their taxes that they're paying.
Well, at the moment your taxes exceed 100%, I think we
Definitely.
should make that clear that basically the other districts are throwing extra money your way.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're getting subsidized.
We haven't been able to show that though.
You haven't yet, yeah.
Yeah. So.
Mark, I don't know if you want to go into this here, or maybe we can talk about it at another time, but you mentioned in passing somewhere along the line about some flack that was coming up about the West Marin coastal projects. Is that still going on?
It's still going on. We have a somewhat organized group that's opposing us in our work. It's quite frankly, I'll be blunt, it's misinformation.
So they haven't gone away.
They have not gone away. So, and I'll give you an example of some of their messaging, is that when we created the public works plan, we had to have a map that shows all the possible areas we may do work. That map is 44,000 acres. We are not planning on doing 44,000 acres of work, nor could we ever afford to do 40, but their information that they are sending out to people to come and then have them call us or send us emails are saying that we are going to work in all 44,000 acres. And that we are going to be, they're saying our work is deforestation. They say that we're going to be killing thousands of animals. They've created a website that has our logo on it, and they have turned our name into the Marin Wildlife Destruction Authority.
Yeah, I've been there.
So that's the type. We received 9,920 emails opposing.
And this isn't the only place where they're active.
No, and it's a boilerplate email.
Right. So you're getting from all over the world.
But we had 100% support of our board when the California State Parks did their PWP. It had the same exact group opposing them with 11,000 emails. The Coastal Commission approved their PWP unanimously. So I anticipate a similar response for us.
And Tamales Bay State Park went through with their plan as well. They were running into the same exact
Same people.
opposition. Same opposition.
So what do people do to counter that disinformation campaign? I mean, it's almost like you need a PR firm to.
You have to be careful because you also don't want to fan the flames.
Right.
Give them
You don't
more
want to give them more
credibility.
press than they are.
We have just been continuing.
Public service.
We've been continuing to push the science that we are using, and we also happen to have a few public commenters come on into our meeting that were well-respected scientists, Daniel Swain and Michael Goldner, and have them speak positively. So,
Pushing back.
but instead of what we want to do, instead of engage in the negativity, we want to continue with our positive messaging of what we're doing.
Great.
speaking of messaging, is there a commitment to continue to do Ember Stump in the coming years?
Yes.
To keep it annual?
There could be a year or two that we skip
Because,
but after seeing a 20% increase, I'd be surprised if we skip next year. Can't guarantee it, but I would be surprised.
right.
Any other questions from the Oversight Committee?
Can we,
Any others? If not, then we should see if there's a raised hand.
Still nobody.
No, okay.
so.
All right. Any other committee points on this discussion? Nothing, we don't have a motion required. All right, so then I think we move to the consent calendar. And did anybody have a problem with the August minutes? Anybody need to pull this, or can we go ahead?
Do you want me to move to approve?
I'd be happy to second.
Okay,
Right.
first and second.
First from Minikis, second from Macaulay.
Okay, and then Jenny? Aye.
Since we're all online, we can do all in favor.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Awesome.
Wow, it's been a while since we've been able to
Yeah.
do that.
If we have someone.
It
remote,
feels
then we can
good.
roll call.
Gotcha. Okay, so then we'll move on.
Okay, so annual report committees, I just wanted to have a chance for any updates that people wanted to offer, and I'll go first with local. Rebecca's not on, we're just waiting for the staff report, so we're in a holding pattern until we have the staff report, then we can finish writing it. But I did want to make sure, Martina was so nice to include the templates, just as a reminder, so hopefully it's easier for people to just plug and play with the templates that we circulated at the end of last year.
And
just
I want to comment about how much I appreciate the templates, that they were well done. I'm assuming that Rebecca had a significant role in that, but that's something that I've wanted done for years, and it saves so much time on the back end when everything is done to the same standards on the front end.
Yeah, that's the hope, and also your contributions to the style guide, so that if we can try to adhere to the style guide, it's a little bit less copy editing and make it flow consistently. So that's really it for the local, and as soon as we have the staff report, we'll finish that up. So I think we can move on to D-Space.
Yeah, so nothing, no change from last month. So we're just waiting for the numbers, basically. You know, we're pretty far along in our observations, which I shared with you previously. We might have one more, but we're gonna wait until basically after we get the numbers, and we can wrap things up, so.
And we're at 12 out of 17 agencies reporting.
Related, just one quick question. We had difficulty with numbers last time, both with the delay in getting the audit done and with the fiscal versus calendar and all that stuff. Is that all been sorted out with Elisa so that we can get to the financial section without substantial delay?
I believe it'll be smoother this year.
Okay. Because that will be a collective obligation for us also, is to look at the financial stuff, which should be very quick if it all ties.
Yes.
You know.
I think we identified the major stumbling point from last year. We'll be able to not repeat it.
Hope springs eternal. Core?
Well, I can give a few words unless Larry wants to maybe jump in, but we had a very productive meeting with Mark on Zoom a couple of days ago, and essentially what we had done is we met, Larry, Pat, and I separately in advance of that meeting with Mark, and we just kind of went through the core projects and raised issues that we had some questions about, and then we put those into a spreadsheet, which I have a couple copies of here. I know Mark already has this, but and Larry does, but it was basically just going through the projects that we wondered about. And I'm, as the new guy, probably the least qualified to raise any questions anyway, but I had a couple. Larry had some, Pat had some, and so we just put them down, and then we walked through it with Mark, and one by one he explained things such as, well, this allocation is going to be utilized in this way. For example, a vehicle would be partly shared cost with the district versus MWPA. The time period for employment, if it was a new staff position, and essentially answered almost all the questions. There are a couple that he wanted to look into a little bit further, so there'll probably be some follow-up on that. But basically, it was a very productive session, and those are the ones that we kind of walked through. I don't know if anybody wants to amplify that or.
So it's kind of interesting because in D-Space, we have some similar questions regarding both full-time, part-time, payroll, what's the evidence that the people are not drifting into other activities?
Right.
And then the question about, cars and vehicles, I should say, and how they operate. So maybe as we get closer to the end, when there's a write-up, we might be able to figure out a way to do it
Meld it
once
all.
versus twice or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
And I think the questions you guys are asking is timely in regard to the operations committee and a couple of ad hoc subcommittees that are going to be looking at centralization versus decentralization of efforts, and both in vegetation management work, in D-Space, and also in public messaging. So the questions I'm hearing are very much in alignment with the questions the ops committee started to ask.
I did email you that, didn't I?
Yeah, I did. You will, what I promised them is that normally when I get questions brought to me in these groups, I try to respond in writing as well as verbally. So
Oh, that's right, you were gonna do another column.
So I'll add a column, and
Yeah.
my goal is by the end of the week, I'll have that back to you.
Great, if anybody wants, we got a couple copies of that.
I figure me putting in writing is you guys holding me accountable for what I say.
So the spreadsheet's great to see now as a sort of interim thing, and the idea would be to whittle this down before the report is written, instead of, it's not like this exact thing will be in the report.
Yeah,
That's a
Yeah, Pat probably knows better than I.
I think this is sort of a natural progression, but it feels to me like we will write shorter and shorter reports, because as time goes on, things that we have noticed have been taken care of.
This
Those
is
have
part
been
of our
ironed out.
discussion yesterday.
Yeah, and, there were very little that wasn't answered
Yeah,
satisfactorily, so it's a little bit hard to think about what we are going to write up.
I mean, in the methodology, you could still talk about the fact that you had a list of 12 questions or whatever it was.
Right.
Yeah, can I maybe jump a little bit into this question of the report outline, because it seems like an appropriate time to do that. So are we going to collectively within the overview section of each of our subsections have some sense of description of the work that we did, so that the public knows that we're not just,
Yeah.
I think
so I would think in the overview element of the outline, that would be a section.
Describe the steps taken.
What we did, we interviewed, we looked at this, these were our questions, those kinds of actions, I think make sense. So connection with this, same idea, you may not want to put all those in there, but you could summarize, I looked at 15 questions, and this is where we collected them, and then we received adequate answers. So that was kind of my sense on the.
Or actually, could we put this in as an addendum and say, this is how we presented it on the state, and here's.
Sure, it's the call of each of the subcommittees
So
as to what they're.
because it
Yeah.
shows what we were looking at.
Yeah, we did that on local last year. Right? It was local, yeah. We did our sections where we said what our findings were. And I think that there's gonna be to some degree a little flexibility here in that, as I recall from last year's cycle, there were some cases where it's city by city by city, and then you put your findings after, within them. So I think there's gonna be a little flexibility as we write it, but I just wanted to understand fundamentally, overview is where you put scope,
Yes,
could be
and
within
methods.
there, right,
Scope
okay,
and
good.
methods, I think.
And then, findings, recommendations, and then, yes, follow up. And no conclusions, we don't want to conclude by subsection, we do one conclusion at the end.
Well, and I think that helps at the point that you were saying, maybe there's a way with the similar questions that you have, rather than being really repetitive
Right.
and asking the same questions that
Right.
you pulled into conclusions.
Right, exactly. If court comes ahead, you can say, court had these questions and we had similar questions, that way. And once we have documents, I think we can sort that out. And I'll just close that element. I did bump ahead a little bit further on the agenda and apologize for that slightly. I do think in the financial section, just a whimsical thought, I've kind of looked through the last couple of reports, and of course, tying all those numbers out was one of my big things, but we have this rollover by city, right, within each of the categories. I think we could maybe put that in an appendix as compared to
That would be lovely.
in the front, because it's right up there. I just think, as much as I love numbers, I think once, we can probably push that to the back. It would be a stylistic recommendation we can deal with later, so.
And I'll add something. Scott, I appreciate your commitment and your willingness to learn. You've said a couple times I'm a new guy, but it's
As we all were.
real, as we all were. And Pat, for your diligence. I mean, Pat just really digs into this stuff and it's really appreciated.
Thanks, Larry.
Any other questions from the committee? Before we take it out, anybody from the public? No? Nope. All right, so then we can move on, no motion required, and we have just a couple of, board monitoring committees today. Executive and board of directors, so in case anybody doesn't remember, executive committee coverage is Scott and Larry.
And we canceled the executive committee meeting for last month.
So we're good.
Yeah.
So then,
Great job.
so then board of directors, Jim and Rebecca, and Jim's gone, Rebecca's gone.
Well, I was, and you spoke of it, really, it was the PWP took up the majority of the meeting. It was very informative. It's kind of worth watching, even if you're watching at 1.5 or something, but it's worth watching. And Mark, you probably want to add to it, and it does say that, I just noticed, it does say the 44,000 some acres, I see how
And so,
heavy.
first of all, I want to
I'm so excited
commend,
if it was 44,000.
Yeah.
I want to commend Anne and Emily from
Yes.
Panorama for a very well-designed presentation. And regardless of what some of the members of the public may say, to me, this was actually a good example of good governance where the entity, and I'm being biased, but the entity that was pushing forward the proposal actually did listen to every single word that was either said to us or sent to us in writing. And that presentation that Anne and Emily pushed forward actually was answering every single comment that we received. And I think one of the things where some people get lost, just because we don't agree with your comment, doesn't mean we didn't hear it and we didn't digest it. So there's to me, that's a key point. And so, like I said, 9,920 emails of this. Fortunately, it was the same email, but we also had a probably another 40 plus more written comments, and some of them were 100 pages long. And so there was a tremendous amount of content to go through. And like I said, the presentation that Anne and her team put together addressed every single comment up front.
It's really work. And I was this close to pushing my I want to speak button after a certain speak. I was thinking of you, don't feed it. I was this close. And I said, no, I'll hold off. I won't go any further.
The era we live in, you know?
Okay. And then no operations meeting.
No.
No.
So I think
That was
that's
it,
it for now. Is there a retreat coming up?
We have the Ops Ad Hoc Subcommittee working, and then probably November-ish, we will have a board retreat.
Oh.
Any other questions about the reports from the committee?
As a future agenda, I'm just curious as to how we feel about what's gonna happen when we lose current members that are terming out and what the status of recruitment is.
So who,
Yeah, is there like a
I
list
have
of,
lost track of who is when.
Pardon me?
Aren't we about to lose you?
No,
Me.
No, Larry, okay, got it.
I don't think
So
so.
how much, when were you?
I don't know.
I've lost track too.
I'm pulling
sorry.
up the spreadsheet.
So is it
I
Larry
think I
and
know. I
Rebecca?
forget.
I'm glad.
And-
Thank you. No, we need you.
I think it's me and Rebecca. I think you.
Well, there'll be one more.
Oh.
It's
There's,
always three.
yeah, and it's probably.
Clearly a
who's
relevant
its-
future
who's its
agenda item.
name?
Yeah, we definitely, we can include it in the next meeting, but actually, I do think you're up, but you're eligible for renewal.
Yeah, I was just doing a partial term
Right.
for
Matt.
Max.
Max.
I just took over from
And
Max.
so
And
you're,
does that even count for the 2 terms?
and that's a decision for you guys to make, the consensus.
Not that I want.
Well, and well, let's make this an agenda item in the future.
Yeah.
We're kind of going deep into something that's not on the agenda.
I don't know what my term is either, because I'm
Um,
filling in for someone.
Let's see,
Yeah, I think
so
we all started.
the 2027 roster, the people who came on and started their new tenure in 2027 is Jenny, Jim Wagner, and in the vacant community-based organization.
2027.
Those who came on board or would expire in 27. Those who expire in 25 is Rebecca, Larry, and the taxpayer.
That's
That's
I
what
was
I always-
trying
that's
to
it, yeah.
remember his
And
name.
those who retire in 26
Kingston.
is Macaulay, Pat, and Scott Pinsky.
Anyway, clearly something we need
Yeah.
to be aware
We
of.
need to have an eye on it.
Fortunately, I do have a spreadsheet that tracks all that.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Any other
And,
questions?
and I retired totally
Because you've had your two
because I've
terms.
had my 2 terms.
Next year.
Scott- Next year,
Right.
Scott will retire temporarily.
What slot do you fill
San Rafael.
in? San Rafael.
And
In life,
he's a fire prevention community.
also Vanderbilt.
Firewalls,
alum.
Yeah, so
So the way it works.
recruiting is
Yeah, so the,
definitely an agenda item.
so the way it works is if you fill in for somebody, there's an open question as to whether that starts your clock, as to whether you. That's, cause you can do 2 terms, right? Is that the deal? Yeah.
And so that's a
Two
decision
full-
you
two
guys,
full terms
that's
with two-
a, and so that's why this is next COC meeting, that would
Okay,
probably
got
be a good one, because Jenny came in midstream, you came in midstream.
Exactly.
Yeah, so the question is, if you
Does
complete
midstream
a
count?
partial term,
Yeah.
does that count as 1 term?
Right,
And you get 1 more, or do
Right.
you forget that and you get 2 full ones after that?
Exactly.
And that's up for you guys to determine. your-
And why is it up for us to decide? That's kind of unusual.
Well, that's,
Is that how we wrote this then?
yeah,
It's
that
not,
we.
not to the board of BOS or not to the,
No,
the board?
we wrote,
We wrote-
bylaws,
okay,
and.
so it's like the US Senate.
Yeah, it was,
Could be the
And that
bylaws
was,
are
that's a
silent,
question
so.
that wasn't answered
Right.
in the
Right.
bylaws.
Yeah.
We didn't anticipate that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
so we'll make that an agenda item for next
Okay.
week.
Noted.
And then when is, we were meeting every month for a while, and we needed to because there was a lot of internal stuff that needed to sort out. Now it's just about get the main thing done, so when are we gonna next be ready to meet? And part of that is a function of when you're gonna be done with your work so that we can do our work, right?
And so today's September 30th, which was the due date, we've got 12 out of 17, so we need to put some more pressure on the 5 that haven't turned their stuff in.
When's the next check go out?
December. That's the problem. And what he means by the next check is that if they don't have their data in time, they don't get their D-space and multiple checks.
Do we meet in October then? I mean, we have a meeting on the books in October, but
Well, that's
we
what I'm
don't have
asking.
any
So-
teeth.
Yeah, if we can't do it at work, then let's, as much as I love you guys, I got other things I can be doing. So, when are we gonna really be in a position where we can get some more work done? Because I don't think we need to meet again until we actually have product.
Exactly.
And realistically, what are we shooting for? Because we dropped you in December, right?
Mhm.
And Rebecca in December, right? And that was a problem last cycle because we had
Yep.
scheduled departures and a couple of us had
Empty
not been
report.
finished core. Cause there was no one to do the core work, so, So I guess my question is when realistically, it's kind of in your court, when you're gonna be ready for us and that should drive when we next meet, I would suggest.
I suggest having one scheduled and then we can cancel if I don't have the material for you.
Okay. So Chair, you can just find out whether there's anything that's changed or whether we.
And we'll let you know. So November 26th is the November meeting and October 22nd. So we might skip October 22nd. So I'll reach out to you on like
Okay.
the week before
Okay,
and just do a status check.
sounds good.
Let's see if I got that.
November 26th sounds like right before Thanksgiving.
And what we've done typically for that is we've pushed it to the first Wednesday of December. And so that kind of takes care of the November and December meeting.
Yeah,
So.
So could we have, would Martina send updated meetings
Yeah.
around then so that we don't have the November one?
Yeah.
So delete that one and put first week of December.
That typically, that's what we've been doing to help bridge Thanksgiving and Christmas.
So I'm losing a little track here. So the October 22nd, I've got that on the calendar, right?
I'm
So
gonna reach
that's-
out to Mark on October 15th.
Right, as to whether we're gonna do that or not, because you got some timeline things you gotta be careful of, right?
Mhm.
In terms of the Brown, our friendly Brown Act. And then the November one would be
Shifted into.
26th, which is the day before Thanksgiving, so
So
that's.
it's-
So we'll shift it to the first Wednesday of
Moves to the
December.
third.
Right, okay, got it.
So are these Wednesdays, or are these Tuesdays? We've somehow gotten off of our original
These
Wednesdays.
are Wednesdays.
Okay.
And Martina was nice enough to give us like little I mean, I had to go to, I was thinking, oh shoot, that's coming, literally, I've been busy, oh, I better see what's on the agenda. We didn't get pushed out to us, here's your agenda and all that kind of stuff. No, obviously I found it, but it would be friendly to.
No, she pushed it out.
I didn't get it.
You did?
I got
We'll
it.
have to check because I got it.
I didn't get an email. Said you do remember.
Spam maybe?
Yeah,
Well, I'll double check
Could be.
with Martina and
Could be
email
spam.
address.
Yeah, I got it, but yeah, we wanna make sure that you don't have to go hunting for it.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I remember it, so it was okay. Costco, Instagram.
We'll have Martina double check her email list.
You got it there? Okay. Yeah, I don't think I got it, but I might have missed it. A lot of things were there.
You're a busy man, you just miss things.
Okay, all right, we are ready to move on. No public, right? All good?
You know, and what I need to know from you is the assignments for committees to be monitoring.
The board one, so I can do that for you. You and I are on ops,
Ops, okay,
and we were off the hook this month, or more.
yeah, and ops wouldn't start again until December, I don't think, is that right? Because ops.
We might start in November.
Okay, because ops just,
That's where I'm suggesting Martina could be very helpful to all of us to remind us we have roles, responsibilities.
what's
You, who
Scott,
meeting's coming up?
what's Scott?
Executive.
Exactly.
Exec, yep.
Okay.
Yep, and he's with Larry, and then Jim and Rebecca are board.
Okay.
Okay, so the next item on the agenda was information items, which were just referenced, the style guide and the template, so nothing there. We've just talked about future agenda items, any others, last shot at suggesting future agenda items?
Just membership of the committee.
Yeah, I think that we need to talk about bylaws. Revising bylaws
In regard to membership.
in regard to what happens to these people who served only a partial term.
But not a complete look, and that's already on our list, so not a complete look at the bylaws in their
Bylaw
entirety.
implications.
Yeah, right.
It's an outcome of that decision.
Sounds good. I think we're good to adjourn. Nobody has anything else? Ready? We will adjourn the meeting.
All in favor?
All right.